Down. Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it's Conservation Week this week, and it's particularly significant this year because of the historic announcement that Ngā Tūhoe are prepared to accept the Crown's offer to settle their claims and grievances under the Treaty of Waitangi. A major part of that settlement relates to Te Urewera National Park. The Government plans to introduce special legislation that would give the park its own separate legal identity rather than being a national park managed under the National Parks Act 1980. Mr Speaker, that will be landmark legislation because of the way in which it must combine both biodiversity protection and adequate recognition of Tūhoe's cultural, spiritual and historical connection with Te Urewera, and we look forward to it. But, Mr Speaker, the Minister of Conservation has marked Conservation Week by announcing an increase in penalties for the smuggling of our native wildlife. That's very welcome. But getting tougher on wildlife smugglers cannot disguise this government's neglect of the spectacular landscapes and of our native, Indigenous wildlife and plant communities. And the previous speaker was a case in point. He was talking about Bathurst Resources quietly getting on with the job without just totally failing to appreciate the significance of the Denniston Plateau, where that open cast coal mine by this Aussie coal miner is proposed to take place. The Denniston Plateau is one of the key areas of conservation land which this government should be protecting and preserving. It's one of our special places. It's no place for an open cast coal mine. Because, Mr Speaker, this government repeatedly talks about balance. If it was serious about balance, then it would recognise that the Stockton Plateau has been much mined over recent decades, and much of the remainder of the Stockton Plateau, which is adjacent to the Denniston Plateau, is proposed for mining, and it would keep the Denniston Plateau and the unique coal measure ecosystems that that plateau is home to as conservation land, which is protected because of its distinctive character. These coal measure ecosystems, they're plants and animals that are adapted to live in these very harsh growing conditions, the infertile, acidic soils. We've got over 20 different species of earthworm on the plateau alone. That's more than exist on the rest of the West Coast. We've got giant carnivorous Pauelephanta land snails, which go right back to Gondwana. We've got a giant weta species. We've got species that were previously undiscovered, like a moth species, until Forest and Birds BioBlitz. The Denniston Plateau is no place for this government's crazy economic development, trash the environment plans. It's a place that should be protected as conservation land. It's got small pygmy plants. The government's failure to recognise that these species have value. It's miserly when it comes to investing in conservation. It's cut $54 million from the conservation budget, yet it's spendthrift when it comes to propping up polluters like Fonterra shareholders, like coal miners, by subsidising them through the very flawed ETS scheme, yet it slashes money from conservation, and it fails to recognise that our public protected lands are the essential infrastructure of our economy, and that a healthy environment is the basis for a healthy economy. Mr Speaker, the government needs to invest much more in conservation, not the piddling expenditure that we've seen on Conservation Week this week, and it's a reflection, I guess, of the overall miserliness with the conservation budget, that this year the department has spent $3,000 on Conservation Week. It used to spend $30,000 each year on Conservation Week, enabling it to educate a lot of children, provide literature, handbooks, posters, bookmarks, to have a lot more activity around New Zealand in reaching out and showing a lot of school children how special a lot of our conservation lands were, why we have to protect our forests, our wetlands, our estuaries. That's been cut back as part of an overall cutback in conservation funding, which is seeing failure to do adequate pest control, failure to acquire new unprotected areas to add to the conservation estate, failure to do proper advocacy, the department being absent from a number of critical resource management hearings, and yet instead the government is propping up polluters through the failed and flawed ETS scheme. Mr Speaker, a healthy environment is the basis of a healthy economy. Protecting places like the Denniston Plateau, not opening them up to mining, is protecting those areas for present and future generations, for their values and their value for tourism.
Mr Speaker.
Katrina Shanks.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts.